Hello and welcome to Sound Strategic, the podcast of the International Institute for Strategic Studies. I'm Meia. Today we will examine the recent developments in Japan, looking in particular at how the COVID pandemic has affected the country's economy, domestic politics, and strategic policy in the midst of US-China rivalry. Joining me are two of my colleagues from the IISS's Japan Chair program based in London. Robert Ward is the Director of Geo-Economics and Strategy and the IISS Japan Chair. Yuka Koshino is the Research Fellow for Japanese Security and Defense Policy, and her research focuses on Japan's foreign relations, security and defense policy, and economic statecraft. Welcome, Yuka and Robert.
Hello, Meia. Great to be with you.
Thanks for having me.
Robert, let's talk about the domestic situation in Japan first. We heard last month that Japan lifted its nationwide state of emergency, and it would seem like the country is slowly returning to some sort of normalcy. Can you take us through how COVID has impacted the Japanese economy in particular?
Of course, a very good question to start with, because Japan's really facing quite significant headwinds this year, as indeed, of course, are many other countries. One important thing to note, however, is that Japan went into this crisis already pretty much in recession. That's largely the result of the consumption tax increase that the Prime Minister Abe Shinzo pushed through in October last year. And of course, as with tax rises everywhere, but particularly in Japan, there is always a fall off in consumption after the tax is increased. So Japan went into this with a weak economy. And of course, this has hit the economy for six, the pandemic has. So in this year, Japan in 2020, Japan's going to have probably the worst, deepest recession that it's had since the end of the Second World War. Unfortunately, the outlook for 2021 is not particularly good either. And I think it's fair to say that it isn't really going to be until 2022 that the economy sort of manages to regain some of the ground it lost in the recession of 2020.
And how has this affected domestic politics in Japan? I think just last month, the Asahi Shimbun put Prime Minister Abe's approval rating at just 29%.
Yes, I mean, what a lot has changed for the Prime Minister. A year ago, he was looking at the political scene, the economy, and thinking, I'll have that tax increase. It'll have a negative impact, but then we'll have the Olympics to rev up to. Great for consumption, fantastic for tourism. And then I'll be able to think, do I want that unprecedented fourth term as LDP leader and extend my premiership? And of course, in just the space of a few months, that has all completely changed. As you said, Meia, the opinion polls pretty much all point in the same direction, which is downwards. Now, in part, I think that's just an effect of Abe fatigue. The Prime Minister has been around just for so long, particularly by the standards of Japan's Prime Ministers. Abe 2.0, so his second term, started at the end of 2012. So this is a long time he's been there. This is one of the sort of falling popularity is one of the costs of power, holding power for so long. But unfortunately for him, there isn't really anything positive that he can point to in terms of the economy, I suspect. Certainly over the short term, certainly into 2021, as we've said, it's going to be quite a slow recovery for Japan economically.
What's the likelihood he will win a fourth term?
Well, this was the question that had all of Japan's political watchers aflutter, certainly last year, because he did look. I mean, he ups and downs, of course, like all leaders, but he looked pretty strong. And of course, the opposition is pretty much perennially weak in Japan. So I thought last year the odds were sort of fairly even that he might, if he wanted it, have a go. Of course, Abe is also a great, well, if not the greatest Trump whisperer. So one of the ideas was that if Trump won in November, this would be very good for Abe potentially trying to stay on, because he knows how to charm Trump like no other leader of a big country. But this now, I think, given the problems with the economy, given the sort of fatigue that I think a lot of the voters have with Mr. Abe, and given the lack of optimism, I think, certainly over the short term into 2021, and presumably as well the uncertainties that are lingering over the Olympics for next year, I suspect that the calculus will be how to achieve a smooth handover of power to a successor who can then prepare for the next general election, which is must be held by October 2021.
So also equally turbulent, I think, from what I've seen in the news, is Japan's security environment at the moment. Yuka, can you take us through what this looks like?
So COVID-19 has definitely increased uncertainties in the region to the already existing security challenges and risks around Japan and in the Indo-Pacific region as a whole. So when other countries were starting to deal with its domestic health and economic crisis, China has been relatively improving its domestic situation. We've seen how China has grew much more assertive in maritime, like around the Senkaku Islands in the East China Sea in Japan. There's more vessels intruding the Japanese territorial waters and the contingency areas, and then more activities in the South China Sea. We're also seeing some challenges in cyberspace as more not just the militaries, but also the civilians' activities are moving into the digital domain. And there has been an increasing reported case on cyber attacks, potentially from state-sponsored attacks. At the same time, the pandemic also exposed vulnerabilities in the existing deterrence that has been the cornerstone of peace and stability in the region. So one of the prominent example is when there was the COVID-19 outbreak on the U.S. aircraft carrier, USS Theodore Roosevelt. So it has negatively impacted the new operational concept of dynamic force employment in the region. And not only that, but there's has been some suspensions on joint exercises and more limited contacts between the militaries and between U.S. and Japan and U.S. and its allies and Japan and other forces in the region. The focus on security priorities in Japan and the U.S. on the Indo-Pacific theater hasn't changed. So we won't expect a significant change in the defense spending in the region. But I think it's fair to say that there's a security challenges from the COVID-19 in the region.
So Yuka, you've mentioned tensions with China over the Senkakus, but of course there's also increased tension on the Korean peninsula of late. We've seen recently in Japanese news reporting that Japan has halted the deployment of the Aegis Ashore missile defense system, with Japan's defense minister Taro Kono citing technical issues and the high cost of rectifying them. I was wondering whether you could unpack this a little bit for us. Did the economic downturn as a result of COVID play a role here, or were other factors more important? And how does this affect Japan's ability to secure its national security interests?
I think I would stress that the installment of the Aegis Ashore system has already been a lot of difficulties, especially facing a lot of local opposition from the beginning. So when we go back to around 2017, when the discussions started, it was a time when there was a lot of challenges, nuclear challenges and ballistic missile challenges from North Korea, and the decision to install the Aegis Ashore system, two systems, in Yamaguchi Prefecture and Akita Prefecture to enhance the ballistic missile defense systems. But over time, the costs have increased, and also the North Korean threats has also diversified. So not just the ballistic missiles, but now there's the submarine launched missiles and short-range missiles. So this decision announced by Minister Kono will definitely spark a new discussion in Japan, again, about how Japan wants to deal with its missile threats from neighboring countries.
Robert, did you have something to add?
I did. Yuka made a very important point about Japan's fiscal capabilities, fiscal capacity, and the need to spend on social spending. And of course, this pandemic will really stretch Japan's already creaky public finances. Even before this pandemic downturn, Japan's public debt stock to GDP was about 230%. That's very, very high indeed. Just to give you a sort of a comparison, we worry in Europe when our debt stock goes over 100% of GDP, as in many countries it will, but Japan's already over 200%. And of course, after all the stimulus measures and everything that Abe is quite rightly trotting out, this will push the debt stock up even further beyond 250% of GDP. So over the medium term, I think there are real constraints on what Japan will be able to spend its money on, despite interest rates being really low, of course. And the pressure will be on fiscal reform even more as we stretch out into the 2020s.
Maybe looking a little bit further into the regional landscape, the deployment of Aegis Ashore was also meant to further integrate U.S. and Japan's military ballistic missile defense assets. But I was wondering whether the U.S.-Japan alliance has been changed, altered, strengthened, or weakened during Trump's first term, and where you really see, where you really place the alliance in light of heightened tensions with China.
So actually, U.S. and Japan alliance has been continued to be strengthened under the Trump administration. So even before the Trump administration, the real milestone for the U.S.-Japan alliance was the 2015 upgrade of the U.S.-Japan security cooperation, which basically tried to improve what they can do under the alliance seamlessly, covering new areas like space and cyberspace. But first of all, the President Trump and Prime Minister Abe had a very good personal relationship that has been able to strengthen its diplomatic and security relation between the two countries. But also, in the recent example, is the 2019 2+2, the foreign ministers and defense ministers meeting. The U.S. emphasized that any state-sponsored cyber attacks on Japan would also be responded under the U.S.-Japan alliance, which is a very big statement to ensure the deterrence. Another area that I have been very interestingly following is the U.S.-Japan's space cooperation. Japan, for instance, established a new space situational awareness system, which will continuously monitor any kind of anti-satellite capabilities or any space debris in space. But what it's really trying to do is to strengthen information sharing between the United States and really enhance the interoperability in space domain as well. And Japan is also set to host a U.S. sensor system in one of its satellites that will be launched in the next in mid-20s. So that really shows how strong the defense cooperation between the two countries is. So I would say that it actually has become much more stronger under in the past several years.
So I asked the question because under Trump's first term, I think a number of allies have come under the radar and in the spotlight by this U.S. administration for either not paying their share of the burden for the alliance, for needing to step up to the plate. Have we seen similar requests of Japan by this Trump administration?
Yes, that's actually a good a good point to make, and what I thought I would add to my previous comments. But there are definitely some risks in the bilateral relations as well. So what we are going to see from now on is the negotiation, and that will start from summer autumn between the U.S. and Japan on the cost of hosting U.S. bases in Japan. And as we've seen in the South Korea and United States, so the Trump administration basically asked for 4 times larger the funding than previously used to. And Japan is definitely closely watching this negotiation. They're probably concerned about what kind of requests that the President Trump will make. Other areas that's worth watching is what Japan is going to decide on its next generation fighter project, whether it's going to pursue a domestic development, or whether it's going to cooperate in certain areas with US or UK.
Right. I mean, Robert, then can I ask if the United States is going to potentially request 4 times the amount of money spent by Japan for this defense relationship, can Japan afford that?
So I think clearly there's going to be lots of calculations going into to what Japan will offer and what it can afford and so on. But I think the key point here is that I think Yuka made it is that for Japan, the US is the critical security partner ally, and this is the US is the foundation of Japan's security posture. So Abe, as we've said, has put a lot of effort into whispering Trump, charming him, trying to get him on side. Obviously, it doesn't always work, as all the allies have found. Trump is mercurial, to say the least. But I think Abe will be very focused, or whoever is in power in the coming years, very focused on doing what it has to do to keep the US on board, and also to keep the systems, the military systems, and the technology aligned as much as possible. The other thing, of course, is that Japan is, like many countries now, stuck between China and the US. So China, as indeed for many countries in Asia, China is Japan's largest export market, its largest provider of inbound tourism into Japan pre-pandemic. But the important thing here to understand is that even though Japan's stuck between these two, as many countries are now, Japan is used to navigating this. This has been the case for Japan for many years now. So it's a difficult situation for Japan to cope with. But this is a situation that Japan has dealt with for many years, albeit in different shapes and sizes.
Right. I mean, I think in the last year we've seen that balancing take place before our eyes. Japan has sided with the United States in banning the integration of Huawei equipment into the country's 5G network. But on the other hand, we've also seen last year that Japan seemed to be a little bit more open, perhaps to limited participation in China's Belt and Road Initiative in one form or another. So how should we view the Japan-China relationship at the moment?
I think it's always been sort of pragmatic at best, but resting on sort of shards of glass for all sorts of reasons. Most obviously, the differences over history, although that seems to have ebbed for now. But it is a pragmatic relationship, and Japan is trying to, as I just said, trying to manage the US, its interests with the US and its interests with China. But I think, as you've just pointed out, that its formulation of policy with regard to how it is viewing China's Belt and Road Initiative, for example, is evidence of that pragmatism. And while Japan won't ever openly go and come out and say, yes, we are trying to contain Belt and Road, contain China, because obviously, even though Japan's big, I mean, it's not nearly as big as China, so to contain China is very difficult. What it is trying to do, I think, within this pragmatism, is to offer an alternative, particularly in Asia, an alternative to China, and to help smaller countries, not to help them feel they don't necessarily have to bandwagon with China, to show that there is an alternative in Asia to China. So it's a very sort of delicate balance, sort of delicate choreography, if you like, trying to keep on board with the US, trying to be pragmatic with China, but also trying to be a balancer, particularly within Asia. And it's a very difficult, sort of complex set of diplomatic moves.
Right, and Yuka, I know that you've been looking at this a little bit since moving to London and starting at the IISS. Who are Japan's new partners in its free and open Indo-Pacific vision? I know that it's not only working with the Quad, but also with the European Union. I think we've recently seen statements that Taiwan is a sincere friend and a cooperative partner for Japan. So how do you see greater cooperation taking place between these actors since COVID?
During the first wave of COVID-19, there were a lot of kind of uncertainties about how much room of multilateral cooperation there could be, and many countries were focused domestically. But first of all, I want to point out that even in that situation, Japan actually tried to provide financial and diplomatic support to regional countries to counter COVID-19 and the growing Chinese influence in the region. I would also like to emphasize this remained very low-key and subtle, probably because of the domestic situation. But if you actually closely look at the supplemental budget, for instance, MOFA has funded about 84 billion yen, which is around 800 million US dollars, to support responses in countries like even in the Middle East and Asia. And the Japan International Cooperation Agency has also allocated around like 200 billion Japanese yen, about 2 billion USD, for COVID-19 emergency government-backed yen loans. And since June, it started providing these loans to regional countries like Myanmar and Philippines. And also in the more diplomatic scene, it also tried to demonstrate certain leadership role in the regional multilateral institutions like the ASEAN Plus 3 Summit. So there it proposed to set up, for instance, a Center for Emerging Disease and Public Health institution, or it tried to emphasize the transparent exchange of real-time information when it seemed like the world was discussing how China has lacked transparency over the situation on COVID-19. But if I could make some point about what happened after the first wave, I think Meia's point is right about how there's more growing momentum for cooperation between Tokyo's regional partners like the Quad countries, but also beyond the Indo-Pacific and like the UK. There has been more high-level talks bilaterally, but seems like the discussion in Europe, there's more discussions about how much China is actually a reliable country and also the uncertainties about its intentions. It's of course difficult to assess to what extent skepticism towards China has accelerated in the COVID-19. But there's clearly some policy shift in UK on China, and not just related to COVID-19, but also even in the discussions on 5G. So I think these developments does create new opportunities for Japan's diplomacy.
Do you think that the economic downturn in Japan will impact how effective Japan can be in using its middle power status in all of these different configurations to bolster those geopolitical ambitions?
Well, one thing interesting in your question, you described Japan as a middle power. I think Yuka and I would that could be something we have another podcast on. What is a middle power? And we would probably put Japan slightly separate from the much smaller countries. I think because of its size and its geo-economic endowments and financial clout and so on, I think it has a special role to play. But that's for another podcast. On the clearly the economic downturn is a problem in terms of Japan being able to really flex its influence in the region, certainly over the short term. And I think quite a lot rides actually for the region on Japan achieving as quick a bounce back as possible. One of the lessons I think from the 1990s, the problems in the 1990s, even though clearly again China was a lot smaller then and not growing, but Japan's domestic economic problems, they did have an impact on the region in all sorts of ways. So in the short term, yes, and a stronger bounce back for Japan is better for the region. However, I think one of the interesting things will be over the next few years, at some point Prime Minister Abe will leave office, is just how institutionalized and embedded Japan's international activism is now, even without one day the Prime Minister Abe. And my view is that actually the institutional changes within Japan, the National Security Council, the National Security Secretariat, the Economics Unit that's just been launched in April, actually in the NSS. Institutional changes plus changes within Asia. So, for example, and the Asia-Pacific region, the TPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, the successor to the TPP, of course, that Japan played a big role in keeping alive after the US left. There are some big developments, I think, under this administration in Japan that I think will allow Japan to continue to project its influence into Asia as one of these balancing powers, a builder of coalitions, sort of bringer together of countries, even if there's a longer downturn in Japan than I'm expecting. And even if the next administration is of a different complexion to that of the current one.
Interesting. Maybe just for our final topic, I'd like to briefly touch upon an issue that's gotten a lot of attention lately, obviously with regards to the U.S.-China rivalry, and that is the issue of decoupling between a country and China. Robert, you already mentioned that China is Japan's largest export marker and significant trading partner. But we've also seen, as we said in the start of this podcast, that the COVID pandemic has really highlighted supply chain vulnerabilities. I wanted to ask you both, to what extent do you think COVID will perhaps either kickstart or intensify Japan's efforts to decrease its supply chain dependency on China? And really, to what extent is decoupling between China and Japan even possible?
So, I mean, the D word, you hear it everywhere in all the C-suite, government, policymakers, everybody's talking about this because the pandemic has really focused attention on economic security, on building resilience into supply chains, building redundancy into supply chains, so all sorts of measures to increase economic security. Very important to note, however, that again, Japan, I think, was here slightly ahead of the curve. Japan's and China's relationship, as we've discussed, has been bumpy for many years. It's had its good moments and its bad moments. And after, in 2010, when China temporarily stopped export of rare earths to Japan, that was a real wake-up call for policymakers and business in Japan. I think it was quite a shock, realizing that China was actually not just a big market, but it also was able and willing to flex its geo-economic muscles. And after then, there was increasingly, particularly in Japanese firms, there was the discussion. The strategy was the China plus one strategy. So you put your factory and your bits of your supply chain in China, but you also balance it. You try to mitigate your risks by also setting up factories somewhere, perhaps in Vietnam or Malaysia or somewhere in the region, just so you've got your risks spread out. So Japan, in many senses, was ahead of the curve here. The pandemic, as with many things, it's accelerating trends that are already underway. And you may have seen that in the stimulus package, the government has earmarked some money, a couple of $1 billion, I think, to help Japanese companies do feasibility studies if they want to move their production out of China. In the round, however, my view is strongly that even though you may have some decoupling around the edges, so in strategic industries, particularly around the very, very high-tech areas where there's concerns about security, perhaps in medical healthcare production, perhaps in food as well, there really isn't an alternative to China. There's only one China on the planet. If you're looking for an alternative to China in terms of the infrastructure, the logistics, the technological capabilities, all of that, you're going to struggle to find another site for supply chain, location, manufacturing, and so on, as big as China. So while I expect there will be some partial decoupling, I think that's now inevitable, particularly post-pandemic. I think over the longer term, you're not going to see a full, complete decoupling with the economies of the US-allied economies on one side and China-allied economies on the other. It's a risk, of course, because never say never in this world. But I think full decoupling, China is just too embedded in the global economic system to make that possible.
Right, and Yuka, a follow-up question for you then. How do you think that if decoupling isn't the word that we're going to use, and perhaps diversification of Japan's supply chains are going to be a little bit more realistic as a future policy option, how do you think that could be coordinated with Japan's Indo-Pacific policy agenda?
I guess so. Robert did mention a lot of things, so I don't really have a lot to add. But perhaps maybe interesting development that I've seen happening is not just how to think about economic security and diversification, but maybe how Japan and the regional countries and beyond the Indo-Pacific region, including UK and Europe, could work multilaterally to think about this global supply chain and economic security together. And one of the area during COVID-19 pointed out was really the 5G discussions. Among the various strategic goods that Japan has increased diversification could be maybe the semiconductors. And I would very interesting to see how some new groupings, for instance, proposed by the UK, like the D7, including the G7 and ROK, India and Australia, will come up with new technology kind of alliances, and I would think that some upcoming discussions that will happen.
Fascinating. So I want to take this opportunity at the end of today's podcast to take a look at the excellent work that you're both doing and the upcoming work that we can look forward to following the IISS's Japan Chair program on. Robert and Yuka, what are each the top focus areas of your research going to be in the next coming months?
Well, thank you for that question, Meia. This is a new program for the institute, so we're Yuka and I are obviously very excited to be part of it. One of the things that I'm going to be focusing on, in particular, is Japan's economic statecraft. Now, this isn't new. Japan's been pursuing economic statecraft for many years now, but particularly I think in the last sort of 10 years or so. This has really gained momentum, and as we've been discussing, new institutions, new views about how Japan uses its geo-economic endowments to project its influence into the region and to particularly recently to support multilateralism and so on. So we're looking at economic statecraft, the tools that Japan uses for economic statecraft, the offensive tools, the defensive tools. Trying to get a better sense of how Japan conceptualizes this, how Japan views success in economic statecraft, and how Japan thinks strategically about economic statecraft as well.
Yuka?
So on defense and security side, we will be cooperating with the Defense and Analysis team, DMAT, and we're trying to do like a comprehensive defense capabilities gap assessment. So in this conversation, we touched on various constraints that Japan faces, like the legal constraints, constitutional constraints, and fiscal constraints, and political constraints. But at the same time, the regional security environment continues to deteriorate. And for instance, the Asia-Pacific region is one of the fastest defense spending growing areas in the world. So, and also the pandemic just revealed that there are various ways that the regional deterrence will be challenged. So we will be creating some different kinds of scenarios and analyze how Japan, and in cooperation with its ally US and its regional partners, what are the gaps in the current military posture and capabilities in the region to meet the security challenges.
Well, I'm very much looking forward to what I'm sure will be excellent work on both of those topics. I want to thank you both for joining me today and sharing your insights on Japan, its domestic politics, economic situation, and its role in the wider rules-based international system. And thank you to our audience for listening as well. Please subscribe to Sound Strategic for more in-depth discussions just like this. And to keep up to date with the latest trends in international security and defense, please follow us on Twitter and Instagram. See you all next time.